part of the problem with the way a lot of scholars think about ancient writing is they think about time consumption as the same thing as difficulty. Something might take me all day that's really, really easy to do, right? So all writing was more time consuming. 80 years ago, 100 years ago, before the printing press, making copies, they were all done by hand. So, of course, it took longer. And so, in the case of writing by hand versus printing, yeah, it's easier to print. But when we start talking about, things, writing things out by hand, when that's all anybody could do for millennia, like since the advent of writing, it was done by hand. There's just not a problem at all. It's literally the same word, to draw something or to write something. And if you think about painting or drawing, if you're an artist, who cares how long it takes? You take as long as it takes to get it the way you want. And that's how writers worked in antiquity. Those are the media that they worked with. And nothing was unusual or cumbersome about that. And that's how we need to imagine ancient authors.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. We've got another excellent episode for you today. My guest is Dr. James Barker. He's associate professor at Western Kentucky, fantastic gospel scholar. And we are going to be discussing his new book today, Writing and Rewriting the Gospels, John and the Synoptics. A fantastic new book. It's on the cutting edge of some of the work that's being, some of the sea change I think we're seeing in gospel studies and gospel origins. So I think you're going to be really, really interested in what he has to say. Lots of food for thought, but really an exciting book. And it's, I think, a good introduction into some of the work that is being done currently in gospel scholarship. So excited to introduce that book to you today. There's a link in the description so you can grab it. It's actually a fairly short book, you can see, and really written at a very accessible level. So it'd be a great book to do a book study on or to read through yourself. It's enjoyable read, wide-ranging, but really fun, enjoyable book. So you can check that out. I also have a link in the description to Dr. Barker's academia.edu page, so you can access. He's got a bunch of his scholarship up there that's freely available. If it's helpful to you, you should definitely check it out. If you are new to following us, you're listening to us on podcast, please do leave us a rating, a review. That would be fantastic. And also, this is one episode. If you typically listen to us, you may want to watch us on the YouTube because Dr. Barker brought some show and tell today. He's got some different things that he made that like scrolls and wax tablets and things like that you may want to see the imagery for. So you can check us out there. If you're on the YouTube channel watching us, thank you so much. Please make sure you're subscribed to our channel. If you can leave a like and leave a comment, that's always really helpful. Of course, it helps, get things out there and in the algorithm or whatever. But more than anything, I just like to see how people are, what people are thinking, how they're resonating with what we're doing. If you have other thoughts, that kind of engagement is always great. So please do leave a comment if you would. And if you would like to support the work that we're doing beyond just watching our content, which is always really great. If you'd like to become a member of the Center for Bible Study, you can do so. Any monthly dollar donation is tax deductible, $1, $5, $10, whatever you deem is appropriate. That makes you a member. It helps support the work that we're doing, and it gets you access to all of the classes that we teach on things like books of the Bible, atonement, gospels, backgrounds, all of this kind of stuff. We're constantly doing classes. You get all the access to all of the classes we've taught, and you get updates and then free entrance into all the future classes that we will do, webinars and all this kind of stuff. So it's a great value, and it helps support the work that we're doing. So I'd appreciate if you would to consider that. All right. Well, with that, I think we're ready. Let's dive into our conversation with Dr. Barker. All right. Well, welcome everybody back. I'm so excited to be joined by Dr. Barker. Really excited to discuss this book with you. Thanks so much, Dr. Barker, for being on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Yeah, really looking forward to diving into this with you. I love the book, so it's going to be fun. But before we get into some of the more specifics of the book, could you just give a really brief background of yourself for the audience? So a little bit about kind of, where you're coming from, maybe some of your academic interests, what you're doing now, that kind of thing.
Sure. I started down this path a little over 25 years ago, more than half a lifetime ago. When I
Yeah.
was an undergrad, I studied at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and Dave Dungan was my mentor.
Okay.
And for those who are synoptic problem nerds like me, that they know Dungan as a Griesbach defender back in the day when that was definitely
Yeah.
not popular. But he was so formative and such a great teacher. And I, from the outset, I should just say, like, even though I hold to a different, set of theories in terms of where the Gospels came from, he would be so proud of that because he always would say, "Don't believe this just because I believe it. You don't know enough at this point. Learn Greek, do this, do that." And figure it out for yourself. Think for yourself. His biggest problem with scholarship was just accepting something because it was the consensus. And so that was formative just in terms of how scholarship works very generally. But the fact that he did so much work with me one-on-one. My last year of college, I did an independent study on the synoptic problem, and it was just the two of us. And I did the same thing with canonization, where we just the two of us reading Eusebius, and the kind of tutorials that in a British system is normal for education and higher education, but not very common in the U.S. But for Dave, when he had a student who was that interested in stuff, he wanted to make time and make
That's
room
cool.
for that. So that laid my tracks. And I was doing a lot of campus ministry also while I was in university, and that was formative at that time. A very evangelical campus ministry. And I, even after graduation, I spent a year overseas doing campus ministry. And the more I did campus ministry, the less people wanted to talk about biblical scholarship. And I know that's not true of every campus ministry everywhere. I'm only speaking from my own experience. And it really did sort of lead to a fork in the road where I was either going to continue down the ministry path. And every time I would do that, people just did not care about my academic interests, that I had already taken Hebrew and Greek. And so that definitely steered me toward the academic path. And I remember I kept in touch with the Dungans for years, up until his death. I saw him a week before he died. But by that point, I was pretty far along in my PhD program. But before I'd even started a master's program, I had moved to Nashville, Tennessee. And I said, "Hey, is there anybody at Vanderbilt that I should meet while I'm there?" And he looked straight at me and said, "Yes, you need to meet Amy Jill Levine. She goes by AJ. You should not only meet her, you should try to study with her." And so he gave her the ringing endorsement, and she was so gracious to me in my master's program. And fortunately, I got to continue on with her through my doctoral program. And again, kind of seeing how scholarship works well, she would say, "Well, I don't hold to the same theory that Dave does, but you're exceptionally well prepared for grad school if you've been working with him." And seeing the kind of mutual respect that they had for one another, and that you could disagree, and that didn't mean you were enemies or that there was any sort of animus there. And so she too kind of laid my tracks and pointed me in the right directions. And I always thought I would do something with synoptic problem, which, as we'll talk about, I have. But for my dissertation, I landed in the problem of John and the Synoptics, which is also part of the book. But that was something I never intended. And AJ's Dr. Father was Moody Smith, who was at Duke, who was famous for saying John's just independent of all three synoptic gospels. And I ended up writing a dissertation saying that John used the Gospel of Matthew as a source. And at the time, nobody thought that. I actually met Bart Ehrman after Dave Dungan had passed away. There was an inaugural lecture in his name, and Bart Ehrman was the first speaker for that. And so I got to introduce myself to him and said, I studied with Dave, and now I'm studying with AJ. And he said, "Oh, what are you writing on?" And I said, "John's use of Matthew." And his eyes got really big, and he said, "Well, that's a field that's wide open." and
That's right.
and AJ was on a panel responding to Moody before he passed away. I got to meet him once that day at Society of Biblical Literature. And she was talking about Moody's work and that John is independent of the Synoptics. And she said, although I do have a graduate student who's currently saying that John used Matthew. And when Moody responded to all the people who had commented on his latest book, he said, "Well, AJ, that doesn't surprise me in the least. You always did think for yourself." That's good. So that idea of thinking for yourself, and just because everybody else might not think it, might mean that they've overlooked it, that they've not thought about it enough. And it might mean that you spend 6 months saying, "Oh, okay, that's why everybody thinks that. I agree." But figuring it out for yourself, there's just no substitute for that.
That's good. Oh, I love that. That's such a great introduction. And there's so many things I appreciate about that and resonate with. But the need to continue to check scholarly consensus is, I think, is such an important point. And, I think sometimes we like to have these things that are stable in place, so it's like, oh, we can build off of that, and so when people start to go back and question those things that we're building off of, that can feel a little bit like threatening, but it's so important to do. And you're writing on an area that, if there was a pretty strong consensus, at least it had been a particular theory of gospel origins for quite some time. So maybe could you take us through then some of the history here? I mean, you don't have to get into too much detail, but what are some of the dominant theories of gospel origins that are kind of in the backdrop as you mentioned Griesbach, of course, but yeah, could you just, for our audience, give a little bit of a background? Let's assume that our audience maybe isn't up to date on like the synoptic problem.
Absolutely
needs a brief tutorial or something.
Yeah, and I try to do this in the introduction of the book as well, to say, okay, how can I get 2,000 years of questions of how the Gospels emerged into 20 pages? And so I try to give a good run through. Originally, people just said, well, the Gospels, as they came to appear in the Latin Bible, were placed in the order of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Well, that just must be the order that they were written in. And it's surprising. First off, it's just arbitrary that they're in that order, because we have plenty of so-called Old Latin gospel books that follow the order Matthew, John, Luke, Mark. So they didn't have to be in the order Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's actually an odd arrangement, or even potentially a rearrangement. But we'll get to the technology of the codex in the first place, of when you start to create the problem of having multiple gospels in what we know as one book. That wasn't even technologically possible for 100 years. So people went with that for a very long time. Griesbach is important because in the late 18th century, for Americans, you think 1776. So that's an easy way to remember it. But he comes along and he says, yeah, I think all of those ancient early church testimonies that say Matthew was written first, I'm going to stick with that. But what I think that actually happened next is that Luke used Matthew, and then Mark came along and wrote basically an abridgment of Matthew and Luke. And today, I actually just corresponded with somebody who's writing a book defending this, and he said, hope you're not too put off by this. I said, I studied with Dave Dungan. I'm glad that there's somebody out there who's gonna try to carry that torch for the Griesbach hypothesis. We don't need to be dismissive of hypotheses just because we've come to our own conclusions. That's the last thing Dave and his friends, they called themselves the Griesbach Mafia, that they would want. But and it kicked off 100 years of scholarship. And if you read old scholarship like Ferdinand Christian Bauer in the early 1800s, that's the working assumption that the order of the Gospels is Matthew, then Luke, and then Mark. And it just opens up a century of study to say we need to reinvestigate this, and we need to do so critically. And the long story short of that is we end up with what we call Markan priority. And so we have Mark as the shortest gospel, gives you no birth narrative, no background information of where Jesus comes from, gives you very little of Jesus's teachings, and ends with a young man saying that Jesus rose from the tomb, the end. There is no resurrection appearance, at least originally in the Gospel of Mark. There's a famous later addition to the Gospel of Mark that's a separate issue. But Markan priority really does become a cornerstone for all of 20th century research on the Gospels. But what happens then is a desire to keep Matthew and Luke separate, just separate corners. They did not know each other's works. They're independent of one another. Mark was a common source. That's the common denominator for all of these narratives. But there are a whole lot of teachings that you read, something as simple as the Lord's Prayer, that you read in Matthew and you read in Luke, but you do not read in Mark. So if Matthew and Luke read Mark, but they didn't read each other, where did the Lord's Prayer come from? And so we get the invention of this hypothetical document Q. Q just is short for the German word Quelle, which just means source. Yeah. So the two source hypothesis is that Mark and Q were the two sources that Matthew and Luke used independently. And independently is really the key word there, because what has happened since is to say, I don't really think that Matthew and Luke are independent. And so that Griesbach Mafia I mentioned goes back to the work of Bill Farmer in the 1960s, reinvestigating the synoptic problem. And his go-to was back to Griesbach, mainly because he was adamant that Matthew and Luke were related, but he didn't go all the way back to the so-called Augustinian hypothesis of the order of Matthew, Mark, Luke. And so for all of the faults I see with some of their scholarship, boy, did they do a lot of great work on the so-called minor agreements. Let's just take a story that's in Mark. So Q shouldn't pertain at all, right? Let's look at all the places where Matthew and Luke add exactly the same phrase at exactly the same moment, and omit exactly the same phrase from Mark at exactly the same moment. And we call them minor agreements because the two-source hypothesis has held the hegemony for a century, and so those sorts of alignments can be dismissed as minor. For those of us who think that Matthew and Luke are interrelated, they're not minor at all, especially when you start to count them up. There are an awful lot of them. So what I see as problematic with most of the operating assumptions of so much of gospel scholarship for the last century is, one, there's just way too much appeal to oral tradition. Anything that's different or stands out, well, we just chalk it up to oral tradition. So it can be everything and nothing all at the same time. And then the other problem is there's way too much over-reliance on hypothetical sources. So if there's something that's in Matthew and Luke that's not in Mark, well, let's hypothesize a source. Let's just call it source and abbreviate it Q. And when you get to the Gospel of John, you have the same thing. Well, let's just hypothesize that there was a signs source for the early part of the Gospel of John. And all you're doing is making stuff up at that point. And so I'm incredibly skeptical of hypothetical sources and hypothetical layerings of hypothetical sources. And I want to jettison that. And I want to say we can't really know anything about oral tradition, so let's stop talking about it. Let's talk more about the texts that we actually have before us. And then I think there's not been nearly enough attention paid to ancient writing practices and how people actually wrote books. And since Gospels are books, maybe we should look more closely at ancient book production.
Great. That's really helpful. So to kind of summarize, your proposal is, if we were taking a metaphor of kind of like a snowballing effect, you see a movement or picking up from one gospel to the next, but you're wanting to explain it in terms of, hey, all of these texts are literarily related. We we shouldn't separate them off. And that's different compared to the scholarship you're describing, but it is gaining more and more traction, it seems, within
Absolutely.
gospel scholarship. Yeah.
For the synoptic problem, I adhere, and we can talk more about it, to the so-called fairer hypothesis that Mark comes first, Matthew uses Mark, and then Luke uses both Matthew and Mark. And then what I'm doing is saying, and John uses all three. And so I am in very good company with Mark Goodacre, who is the torchbearer for the fairer hypothesis, and also thinks that John used all three synoptics, and has his own book coming out. He was kind enough to write the foreword to my book, and we've now had a chance each to read each other's books. And he kept saying they're so complementary. We're making exactly the same argument, and they're two entirely different books that you can read alongside each other. So, like you say, that kind of traction is there. And in an interesting way, not the Augustinian hypothesis, right? But in an interesting way, does kind of get us back to what was the dominant view for centuries, that, well, John was well aware of the other Gospels. Now, that argument was made for apologetic reasons, going back to St. Augustine and others even before him, who just didn't want John's differences to be considered contradictory. But we can sort of stay in good company with a whole lot of centuries of ecclesiastical thinkers who just said, well, yeah, of course John knew the other Gospels. And I actually think they're right about that. Now, I'm not trying to do apologetics in my book by any means, but I do think that there's an interesting connection there for those who do come to critical scholarship from a more evangelical background like I do, to say, hey, we can actually read some of these people from the Middle Ages, like Peter Comister and all sorts of folks. Nicholas of Lyra. Read Jerome's commentaries going back, to the turn of the 5th century. Read Augustine's treatises on John and the epistles of John, and read his treatise on the harmony of the Gospels. He's not wrong in a lot of the excruciating little details of where the texts are similar and different. And I think there's a lot to be gleaned there that you can, at the end of the day, like I say, not be apologetic, but also not be dismissive. I always tell students, like, you are not as smart as St. Augustine, and neither am I.
Right.
Just because I don't follow that theory doesn't mean we have nothing to learn from reading, early church thinkers, medieval church thinkers, Reformation thinkers. They have some insights.
That's really helpful. I appreciate that a lot, and I totally agree. I think it's really, really great stuff. Okay, so I think that's a really helpful lead into kind of what you're doing and the backdrop of the discipline and what you're hoping to contribute. Your first chapter after the introduction focuses on the process of writing, which is, I just, it's a really important consideration. And you point out, like, plenty of places where scholars say, like, well, that kind of process couldn't be possible, and I run into that all the time in my focus on reuse of tradition. So how, authors interpret antecedent traditions. And I've had scholars say, well, like, no writer would be engaging with that many traditions in that many different times. I'm like, but they are. So, like, and they're not alone in doing that. So what, so it's so important, I guess, for us as moderns to have the right imagination in place when we're thinking about, like, what exactly were they doing when they were writing these texts, writing these books. So yeah, take us through, like, how do you imagine the process of writing a gospel? And what are some things that are just, you think are really important and relevant to this conversation when it comes to, book production, the kind of techniques and things like that they use? And feel free, if you want, those listening on podcasts, you might want to check this out on the YouTube channel as well, because Dr. Barker brought some show and tell as well, which is, I think, really helpful. So. Sure.
I started down that road 10 years ago. Actually, this summer will be our 10th anniversary of a National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Institute on medieval manuscript production. And so we we literally made goatskin parchment, from scraping the hair off the goat to stretching the skin to scraping it to prepping all your writing materials. And granted, that was the medieval period, and but I used that to work my way back earlier. And so we're working with parchment, and I talked to some folks who said, well, we were talking about the Nag Hammadi codices one day and how important they were from my perspective as a New Testament scholar, because I was hanging out with these awesome medievalists. And so they were saying, well, tell us what these are doing. And so I was talking about them more from a textual standpoint, the way I would teach it in an intro New Testament class. And all of these bookmakers swarmed me of like, well, and they're so important because they tell us how ancient codices were made. And let's look at these bindings and let's look at these diagrams. Let's take measurements. And so we actually went to the lab and made a scale model of an early papyrus codex, and said, this is all you have to do. This is how it works. So I've made a bunch of those over the years. So here's one of the Gospel of John, and it's what's called a single choir, not a church choir, CH, but QUIRE, a single choir, meaning it's just one big fold, and it is tacketed in the middle.
Got it.
And so you wrap it up like this. You tie up the end so that it doesn't fall apart. And you have to know the exact midpoint of the gospel, in this case, the Gospel of John, for the page enumeration to work out. You can really only fudge by like a page. If you come up one page short, you can shove in one blank sheet at the end and cut it off here, or paste it down on the front. But really, you kind of got to know what you're looking at. This is pretty close approximation to the size of Papyrus 75, which would be a single choir codex in terms of how many, a single column on each page.
Could you hold it up a little closer to the camera just to see if we can see the writing a little bit? It's, very nice.
Yeah.
Cool.
So, and then, the tackets, but this is how you hold it together. You punch holes in it and you stitch it. And I've made them in different ways. This one I stitched through the back, but I have a nice one of the Gospel of Luke where I covered over the stitch. It's like clothing, you can make all these different ways. But originally, a book the size of the Gospel of John, when it first began to circulate as a codex, and I argue pretty strongly in the book that it would not have initially been published as a codex, because I think that's a little too early. We're talking about the earliest that we hear of any codex. This is about the size, the shape, the dimensions that you would have had it. So I started working on codices, and there was passing reference to wax tablets, and I kind of filed that away and thought I'll come back to that later. And so when I worked from my parchment codex back to my papyrus codex, I thought, well, now what comes before all of that is a nice scroll, right? Or a book roll, as classicists will talk about it. So I made a nice scale model of the Gospel of John as a scroll. And the most important thing for both of these, you can tell that the paper's pretty thick. Ancient papyrus would have been a little more pliable, but I wanted to get the thickness right, because if you just take our 8.5 by 11 typing paper and copy paper, it's just much too thin. So I would rather get the overall shape and feel of it right, and make that sacrifice. So here is Codex Vaticanus, which if you open it up, looks like a scroll with 8 columns on a gigantic page. Well, here's the Gospel of John in nice, neat columns, and it just rolls all the way through. Yeah. And I made a full-scale replica of it so that I could actually work with a scroll. And there's a famous article that's not read and cited nearly enough by T.C. Skeet, talking about whether it was irksome or cumbersome to roll and re-roll a scroll in antiquity. And so he takes some wallpaper and he rolls from one end of his roll of wallpaper to another and says, yeah, it's not that hard. So I made a scroll, and we have plenty of pictures of people. This is held open shoulder width. I've got 3 columns in view if it's shoulder width. The tighter the grip you keep on it, it's not hard at all. to scroll forward or backward.
Yeah.
And one of the things you see people say that turns out to be wrong when you actually work with your hands and make these reimagine these and remake these and recreate these. The idea is sometimes, well, it would have been easier to go backward and forward in a codex like this.
Right.
Well, you tell me from looking at it, what's easier? To go backward and forward like that, or just to do one of these, right? I could go, if I'm writing a text and I'm not reading it out for, say in a church service, if I'm studying this to write my own gospel, I can just unroll as much of it as I want. Mm-hmm. If I'm working with a codex, this is all you've ever got in view. So it's just another one of those things where I appreciate those who have at least said, let's think about ancient compositional practices, because absolutely that needs to be part of our research, and not nearly enough people have done so. But it's also important to point out things that are wrong when you actually work with the materials with your own hands and you say it's actually not easier to move forward and backward in the codex. It's, in fact, easier to work with a scroll. And when we did first start to see books published as a codex, again, I mentioned you have to know the exact midpoint. How do you do that? You write the whole thing out in full. Mm-hmm. And the easiest thing is to use a scroll, to use a draft, to use the backside of an old scroll, to draft and go through as many revisions as you want. And then you've got a pretty good count of exactly how long this is going to be. But before we ever got to publication, and even in scroll format, you got to sit down and form your first idea. And for me, I do that with a legal pad. I like the canary yellow, and I like the narrowest rule because I've always written small, and I like a 0.7 millimeter Pentel lead pencil. And if I have to use pen, it has to be Pentel, and it has to be 0.7 millimeter. And so I've used that over the years, going back to my dissertation. The whole idea of John using Matthew started from read Matthew one day, jot some notes in a legal pad, read John the next day, start to finish, jot some notes on a legal pad. And I did that about 10 times for each gospel. And that legal pad started to get pretty thick to where I keep seeing this happening. And so I finally took the legal pad to AJ Levine, and she folded her arms, and that's either a really good thing or a really bad thing, but she got a big grin on her face. And she said it would be so ironic if you wrote for me about John's use of the synoptics. But again, it all started from me taking notes on a legal pad. Well, why do I bring all that up? Because in antiquity, this was your legal pad. This is a Roman era scale model of a wax tablet. And I open it this way because that's how they did it. A top page and a bottom page. Nice. Now, this is just a simple bamboo skewer because it's easy to sharpen it and file off the end. And so you can just write your name, real big here. I can write a whole lot smaller if I need to.
Look at that.
Can the camera pick that up?
Yeah,
and then if I need to erase that, well, that's all you do. And I've gone through several different iterations of my wax recipe, starting with beeswax. Well, why is it this nice charcoal color? Because you burn a little papyrus and you throw that in. And it's a whole lot easier to read than if it's just sheer yellow. Yeah. And we have ancient authors who talk about that. Quintilian tells us this. He says, start with the wax tablet. And he has a student, because he's a professor of rhetoric, and he writes a book on how to write a book, and it's longer than the entire New Testament. So he tells us all of these different stages. And he has a student who's too wordy, and he writes everything too big. And he's like, the guy's always using this giant tablet. Take it away from him. Give him a little tablet. Make him write more concisely, because so that he doesn't have as many options. And he says, and leave some empty space on your board, because you're going to need to make some additions, and you can edit as you go. And so this is what's called a triptych. It's got 3 pages. So you want your outside covers to be wooden boards, because if it's wax, it will erase itself if you set something on top of it. But so on my page 1, I've only got 1 page, but lo and behold, my middle page here is double-sided. So now you go to a tetraptych. right? You got 4 pages in there. You got another double-sided page. It's not that hard at all to take a small story. I even have a page in the book where I look at Matthew's story of the healing of paralysis, and all but the last line fits on this.
Oh, yeah.
So again, there are these modern preconceived notions that are really bad misperceptions of what would be difficult in antiquity. If a tablet is how you had written a draft for 1,000 years, it would not be hard for you to do that. And Quintilian talks about the process of cogitation. Before you write anything, think about what you're going to write. Think before you speak is another good rule. But in terms of writing, think about it, and then write it, and then look at it, and then I need to clarify that. I need to change that. And when you're using wax, you have a way to do that. We're spoiled in the modern era because we learn to write with these big pencils we can hold in our hand and these giant erasers at the end, and we can erase, right? But if you're writing in antiquity, this is the way you could erase before you put it onto a scroll for a draft. Because then once it's in ink, it's not impossible, but it's more difficult to make a correction. You can make small corrections, but not wholesale ones. Yeah. But when you transfer your contents, when you fill up a couple of these, you put it into columns on a draft, on an old papyrus roll that you don't need anymore. Because then if I want to relocate an entire passage, I could literally cut and paste that if I want, or I could just annotate it, move this over to there. And if I want to add a whole line, well, I've left myself some generous margins. So I can say to add this line. And if I read something, I thought, what was I thinking? I just said the same thing 3 times. You ever done that when writing a term paper, right? I know that my students do, because I say, you just said that 3 times. But I've done that in my own writing. And so when you try to eliminate those redundancies, it's really easy. Just strike through it. So I think if we envision book production the way ancient authors talk about it, and then you get out your power tools and you actually make this stuff and work with it for a while, and you spend some time working with a scroll, and you spend some time working with a single quire codex, not just making it, but using it and reading from it, right? Not just making it, but writing with it. And saying, well, how fast can I write with this? How much space can I fill comfortably? And so John Poirier wrote a great article on Luke's use of wax tablets, and he sort of hypothesized about how many he would have. And 2 scholars immediately pounced on this as this is totally wrong. And one in particular had obviously never heard of these polyptychs that you wouldn't just have one board, right? Because the response article was talking about, well, how many boards would you mean how many pages? How many pages you would need is not how many tablets you would need, because we get up to 8, an octoptych. We get up to 8 of these, where I've got 14 pages that I can write. Now that's pretty rare, but a pentaptych, I carry around my triptych just because it's easier. But I've got a pentaptych in the closet that's 5. I've got 3 double-sided pages. That's 8 pages, and you can get, even leaving a lot of room, we're talking 2,500 characters pretty easily. Average Greek word about 5 letters per word. 500 words, that would be 1 8.5 by 11 single spaced page, right?
Yeah. Yep.
So you had to write everything by hand. We didn't have typewriters till nearly the turn of the 19th century, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Boy, did that speed things up. I mean, I mentioned Bartleby the Scrivener, one of my favorite short stories of the guys. The lawyer who's got 2 scribes. One does really good work in the morning. The other does really good work in the afternoon. But they make too many mistakes in the other. But then he meets Bartleby. He's just good all day. But he has some quirks. But everything is still written out longhand. And you imagine legal documents where the same thing needs to go to 5 different people, right? If it's a contract, how many copies of this do we need? So that was not unusual that
Yeah.
you would be making all of these copies and they all needed to be exact. And when the typewriter came along and you could just use carbon copy and type it once and have 3 copies and then you white out, all these kinds of ways of making corrections, it sped up the writing process exponentially. But here, to kind of try to land this plane, part of the problem with the way a lot of scholars think about ancient writing is they think about time consumption as the same thing as difficulty. Something might take me all day that's really, really easy to do, right? So all writing was more time consuming. 80 years ago, 100 years ago, before the printing press, making copies, they were all done by hand. So, of course, it took longer. And so in the case of writing by hand versus printing, yeah, it's easier to print. But when we start talking about, things, writing things out by hand, when that's all anybody could do for millennia, like since the advent of writing, it was done by hand. There's just not a problem at all. It's literally the same word, to draw something or to write something. And if you think about painting or drawing, if you're an artist, who cares how long it takes? You take as long as it takes to get it the way you want. And that's how writers worked in antiquity. Those are the media that they worked with. And nothing was unusual or cumbersome about that. And that's how we need to imagine ancient authors. And the last thing I would say is using multiple sources at one time is not difficult in the least. And we have plenty of folks doing that. So happy to go down that road if you want, or switch topics. It's up to you.
That's really helpful. I'm glad you added that last point, because I was going to ask that as a follow-up. I thought that was an important point you made in the chapter, that a lot of times modern models have defaulted to away from that idea of multiple sources, because people have a hard time imagining, I guess, an ancient author having multiple scrolls and their wax tablet open at the same time and, working in that way. But, as you show, that does seem to be what's going on. And so it shouldn't prevent us from then considering that might be what's going on with the Gospels, right?
Because absolutely. And you can, and I would add, you can do it as an individual if you want to. I've done it. I've sat in the floor and I've taken, I have who knows how many copies of the Greek New Testament lying around. But if I want to pretend that I'm John, I just put my wax tablet on my knee and I can open up 3 different copies of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And if it's a scroll, all I need are paperweights. And I can do it with a scroll or a codex. I can do it as an individual, and I can also do it as a group activity. And this is another way we need to just open our imaginations to how people made books. If you're John and we go to the end and we say, well, what if Barker's right? What if he did use Matthew, Mark, and Luke as a source? How would that have worked? Well, one way to do that would be a small group, a school type setting. If I have 3 people, each with their own gospel, and I want to write the feeding of the 5,000, I can say, read that bit from Mark again. The 200 denarii. Okay, let's use that. Read that from Matthew again. Read that from. Why are the disciples all speaking in unison? Does that strike anybody else's odd? Or everybody else is like, well, now that you mention it, that does sound odd. Well, how about let's have a dialogue between Jesus and Philip, and then where did the food come from anyway? Let's have Philip's brother Andrew show up. You can imagine people brainstorming and spitballing this. Go to any writing room today for any TV show that you like, and that's how this stuff works, right? So to say you could have a small group setting where different people have different copies and they're being read simultaneously, that works.
Yeah.
Could an individual have done it? Sure. And I showed that Josephus did it. We know for a fact he wrote his Antiquities of the Jews. We know that he's got Samuel Kings when he talks about the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. We also know that he's got the Chronicler. So why do you have multiple Gospels? Who who would include multiple gospels that are so similar as the synoptics? Well, I don't know. Maybe the rabbis who put together the Tanakh, because Chronicles is in there and it's retelling the same stories that you get in Samuel Kings, right? And when Josephus comes along to write his history of the Jewish people, himself being Jewish, of course, he's got Samuel Kings and he's got Chronicles and he's got them in Hebrew and he's got them in Greek.
Right.
And you can see all of that at work. So he's writing right at the same time the gospel writers are at work. So why can't they do what we know for a fact that Josephus did? I just don't think any of this is difficult or problematic or in any way out of the question. And we need to have more imagination of more possibilities of ways multiple sources can be used, and not this very closed-minded approach that, well, nobody would do that. That would just be too hard.
Yeah, no, that's really good. Yeah. Last thing I'll real quick ask you about too before we move on is, you make a important point about the ways that ancient writers are trained to imitate, but to change in imitation as well, and why that's important for thinking about source relationships, because sometimes we might look at these, it's obvious, right? If you're looking at a passage in like Matthew and Mark and it's the same source and you're like, okay, yeah, exactly the same thing. But then there are other places where like there are motifs that are the same, but they're very different. And so someone might say, well, this can't show a source relationship, right? But you're arguing, no, in fact, these are telltale signs of a source relationship. Could you just take us through that a little bit?
Absolutely. Yeah. Imitation is how you learn to write from first beginning with the alphabet, whichever alphabet it was you were learning, you just learn to write by hand by copying what's in front of you. And then you learn just to copy out sentences and phrases. Aesop's fables, again, Quintilian tells us you have to not only be able to copy them just to show that you can be a scribe at the most rudimentary level. Hey, I would like my own book of Aesop's fables. And you say, well, I know how to write. So for the right price, I can copy them in full. But then as sort of what we might call a college student, you have to then say, all right, here's what Aesop wrote. Now, how would you take this short one and make it even shorter? And how would you, tomorrow's exercise is, how would you take this short one and expand it? And so those types of things are just the assignments that students were given as they imitated. Well, make it shorter. If you think Mark was written first and that Matthew used Mark, we see this as a foundational piece of all of us who think that Matthew used Mark. Mark's gospel overall is shorter, but almost without exception, within individual episodes, Mark's episodes are longer. Because Matthew includes so many more episodes, he has to be condensing Mark to make room for all the other stuff. That is something anybody who could write in Greek in the ancient world would have learned how to do in school. Take it and condense it. And so then the idea of now a really advanced technique, let's invert it. Let's rewrite it in such a way that it's really quite dramatically different. My go-to example for this is Virgil, who we know for a fact in the Aeneid is imitating Homer, right? It's half of the Iliad, half of the Odyssey put together to not be a great Greek epic, but be the great Roman epic. Well, there's this nice motif when Odysseus goes to Hades, and he's been away for 7 years, shipwrecked, and he doesn't know that his mother has died. He's in Hades, and so he sees his mother, and he tries to hug her. And 3 times he tries to hug her, but she's a ghost, and so he can't. And so we see the same thing with Aeneas and his father when Aeneas goes to the underworld. But that's the second time we read it in the Aeneid, because we actually see it moments after his father has died. There's a split up between Aeneas, his wife, and his father, and they're like, all right, we're going to meet up at the rendezvous point as soon as we can. And then moments later, he sees his father, and he says, you're already back. And he tries to hug his father, and it's 3 times. He tries to hug his father, but he can't because his father has died. And so his soul hasn't yet gone into the underworld. And so you say, well, it's his father, not his mother. Aeneas can't be copying Homer. It's not in the underworld. They're in this world. And if you wanted to count up the differences, you could. But if you have, I think, a reasonable person would agree that Virgil is taking that and inverting it and making those changes and making them intentionally. And think about something like the gospel. That's just the synoptic gospels. We'll get to John, because I argue that John does this a whole lot, and that sometimes his differences are those telltale signs that he does in fact know the synoptics. But you can even see Luke doing this, because Matthew and Mark have Jesus curse a fig tree. He's really mad that he doesn't have any figs to eat, so he curses the fig tree and it withers up, right? And Luke has a parable about a guy who's angry that this tree is not producing figs and he wants to cut it down, but his workers like, no, give me another year. Be more patient. And he turns it into this parable. Now, it's a narrative episode in Matthew and Mark, and it's an actual cursing, and it's by Jesus, and it really happens. And all of these elements are different in Luke, but Luke does not tell you that Jesus cursed a fig tree in Jerusalem, right? A lot of us would say that Luke's parable of the fig tree is inspired by Matthew and Mark's actual cursing of the fig tree, and he's changing the story because he wants there to be more time for more repentance, and he can make a whole different theological point out of it. So just because so many details are different, parable, not a narrative, not in Jerusalem, all of these kinds of things. Does the fig tree wither or get cut down, or does it get to last another year? All of those things are different, but I don't think that means that Luke didn't know about it. I think almost all of us are convinced that Luke had read Mark, and an increasing number of us are convinced that he read Matthew as well. I think he gets to that point. He doesn't like that story, but he's like, I'm not going to throw it out entirely. I'm just going to completely recast it. And we see John doing that quite a bit as well, I argue.
Great. Okay, that's a great lead in then. So let's start with the synoptics. Matthew, Mark. We'll go with Mark, Matthew, Luke in the order that you have it. This is the Farrer hypothesis. Can you just take us through a little bit of kind of what you do in the chapter, maybe an example of or two that you think particularly well illustrates? I guess you kind of already gave one, but illustrates the explanatory power of this way of accounting for the three.
Absolutely. I think beginning at the end is always great.
Great.
You can start with the resurrection of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. As we've said, originally it's just a young man who is at the tomb who says to the women, you're looking for Jesus, but he's not here. He's risen. Go tell his disciples he'll meet them in Galilee. But the women said nothing to no one because they were afraid. The end. Well, obviously they had to tell somebody something, or we wouldn't have gotten the gospel written. And we have some really great work on this of Mark as a suspended narrative, as Professor Dinkler at Yale calls it. And for a long time, scholars have said all throughout Mark's gospel, Jesus is telling people to shut up, not tell them who he is. And so finally, when people are supposed to go and say something, they don't, and it's ironic. But the idea is you, the reader, are now inspired to go be the one to share the good news. So I don't think Mark has any problem with that suspended ending. It kind of makes it makes its rhetorical effect, as I imagine Mark. I do not think, by the way, that Mark is intentionally unfinished, as some folks like to claim. If we go to the exact midpoint of the gospel, it is the transfiguration account to the letter, right? So I think ancient authors knew that there is a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I think that it is very well laid out in terms of literary design, but it ends with the promise that you'll see the risen Jesus, but you don't actually see him. And I think when Matthew came along to write another gospel, he did think that ending was unsatisfying. So what happens? Jesus then shows up after the angels to say to the women, tell my brothers I'll meet them in Galilee. And then he does. And he gives them the Great Commission. And Matthew ends his gospel with Jesus saying, and I will be with you forever until the end of the world. The end. And I always go out of the classroom and open the door and I close it and I say, "Where's he at? He said he was going to be here. Jesus isn't here. What's going on?" Well, anybody who reads the Gospel of Matthew knew that Jesus wasn't there in their midst, in the flesh, right? They knew that point, but Luke thinks that he can improve upon Matthew. So, yes, Jesus does show up in the flesh and give some different resurrection appearances. But at the end of the gospel, we are going to get Jesus off stage. He is going to get into a cloud and float up into the heavens, where he has to stay until final judgment, lest you think from having read Matthew's gospel that you might run into him on the street one day while you're just shopping for bread, right? So you see this snowballing trajectory. If you start from Mark's not unfinished. All we had before Mark were Paul's letters. Right. Mark wrote you a gospel. You're welcome, he would say. But Matthew said, "Yeah, but that ending, Mark, really? I mean, think about this. If it were a movie, people are going to be asking for their money back. I'm going to give you a resurrection appearance. You're welcome." And Luke comes along and says, "Yeah, but now you've created this expectation that at any moment I might just run into the risen Jesus. And so I need to explain that he's gone and that he's not coming back, but he is with us in spirit." And so you see that snowball running from Mark to Matthew to Luke. And I just say, when you take all those elements, does it seem like all that's a coincidence? We can start at the beginning. Mark doesn't give you a birth story. Matthew does. It's from Joseph's perspective. Luke gives you a birth story. It's from Mary's perspective. Now, is that just a coincidence? Or does Matthew know that he's writing from Joseph's perspective and Luke knows that we don't have Mary's perspective, so he needs to supplement in that way? And we don't know anything about this character, John the Baptist, and where he came from. And Luke says, "Oh, you didn't know that he was relatives with Jesus?" No, I didn't know that, because all I had read was Mark and Matthew. And Paul says nothing about John the Baptist, right? Who is this guy? So Luke gives you his backstory. And so you can see them playing off each other, but it just works really, really nicely if you roll that snowball from Mark to Matthew to Luke. But everybody who comes along later knows what came before.
Yeah. No, that's good. Yeah, and you could do this exercise with a lot of other things, but I like beginning. I like how you did it with the ending and the beginnings, because that's a great place to kind of illustrate that. Okay, so I think that the part that I was even more excited to read was the connection with John to the Synoptics. I personally, I think I'm totally with you on the fire hypothesis. I found that to be the most convincing, personally as well. And I've been more or less ambivalent about John's relationship to the Synoptic Gospels. I've always told my students I think he at least knows Mark and maybe other Synoptic traditions, but I've just it's not been my area of expertise, and so it was really fun to kind of read what you do there. So yeah, can you kind of take us through how you establish John's relationship? I mean, I guess it's kind of similar. It's an extension of the argument, but take us through kind of how you see John's relationship to the Synoptic Gospels, not just to like one or a broader tradition, but to each of the three. Yeah.
Yeah, and I started with this with my dissertation. I did John's use of Matthew because there was an article or two, and that was it. And Rudolf Schnackenberg wrote this famous 3-volume commentary on the Gospel of John and how it was composed and how it is and isn't related to the Synoptics. And he said, special contacts between Matthew and John are rare and unimportant. And actually, when I met Moody Smith, he was, again, just so gracious. And he said, well, John and Matthew is a good way to go because there's not been anywhere near as much done on it. And so I just started making a note of all the places that I saw points of connection. And there turned out to be a lot more than I thought. So then I went through all the scholarship and found, okay, other people have noticed this or they've noticed that. But then I found a couple of little things that I thought I knew that others didn't, and then I found some bigger ones. But one that's in Matthew that also applies to Luke and gives us a nice snowball is if we just ask the Samaritan question, right? What do the Samaritans have to do with Jesus? Well, according to the Gospel of Mark, they have absolutely nothing to do with Jesus because there are no Samaritans. There's no reference to Samaria or Samaritans. But if you get out your atlas, as you should when you're reading the Gospels, and you trace Jesus' journey to Jerusalem, you see that he appears literally to go out of his way to avoid Samaria for the one trip in the Synoptics when Jesus goes to Jerusalem during his ministry, where, of course, spoiler alert, he dies. The other spoiler alert is he comes back to life. But when he crosses the Sea of Galilee, the implication is he then goes south down the Jordan River. But then we encounter him in Jericho, which means he has to have crossed the Jordan River again if you're looking at an atlas. And what is he doing? It sure looks like he's avoiding Samaria. And I talked about Josephus earlier. He tells us that in the early 50s, there were some pilgrims that everybody used to just go shortest distance between 2 points, north to south from Galilee to Jerusalem for Passover, but some Samaritans attacked them because they didn't worship in Jerusalem. They had their own Mount Gerizim, that's their place of worship. And so from then on, people avoided Samaria when they would make their pilgrimage from Galilee. So the Synoptic Gospels are actually anachronistic in that regard by a couple of decades of having Jesus avoid Samaria. And so Matthew takes up this question and makes it more explicit. So what does Jesus have to do with the Samaritans? Nothing, but because Jesus says so in as many words. He sends out his disciples and he says, go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, only to them, not to any Gentiles and not to any Samaritans. And then the Great Commission, which we've alluded to, he says, now go to all the Gentiles and evangelize them and make disciples, preach, baptize them in the name of the Father, Son, and Spirit. So we have the Gentiles getting picked up. They're left out of the apostles' mission in chapter 10. But the Gentiles are included in the Great Commission in chapter 28. But there ain't a word about the Samaritans. They are left out in chapter 10 and they are left out in chapter 28. They do not appear to be evangelized according to Matthew. Luke then takes up that question and says, well, what do the Samaritans have to do with Jesus? A little. Jesus didn't reject the Samaritans, like Matthew seems to imply, and he didn't just ignore them entirely, as you would know from reading Mark, where there are no Samaritans and no reference to their place of Samaria. Luke says that on the way to Jerusalem, Jesus wanted to stay in Samaria, but they didn't accept him. And so James, as it's always translated, though I insist upon translating it Jacob, because, it says Jacob if you read Greek. So Jacob and John as or maybe we should call him Johann if I'm really going to press the Jacob point. But James and John say, let's burn this Samaritan village to the ground. I'll call down fire from heaven, like Elijah did. And Jesus tells them to chill out, leave the Samaritans alone. And so the Samaritans reject Jesus in the Gospel of Luke. But if you read the book of Acts, the Samaritans eventually get evangelized. And even the rewriting of the Great Commission expressly says, begin in Jerusalem and then go to Samaria, right? And then to the rest of the whole world. So, and the book of Acts, that's kind of your literal roadmap, because all roads lead to Rome, and we're going to end up in Rome by the end of the book of Acts. So you can see that nice snowball from Mark, nothing about the Samaritans. Matthew, Jesus damns the Samaritans. In Luke, it's the Samaritans who rejected Jesus, not the other way around. And John rewrites this most thoroughly and says, no, Jesus didn't condemn the Samaritans. And the Samaritans didn't reject Jesus. Maybe some Samaritans did one time, but this other time, Jesus went to the Samaritan city of Sychar, and he talks to this woman by the well, and they have this long talk that's full of innuendo. If you've read that great essay, which is always mind-blowing to my students, but I'll avoid that rabbit trail. The point is, the Samaritans believe that Jesus is the Savior of the world. And so they believe because of the Samaritan woman's testimony, and they believe for themselves because Jesus stays there for 2 days. Again, it is a nice, neat snowball, but we have a lot of rewriting in play. But you have to ask yourself, is all of this just some oral tradition and people got it wrong, like in a game of telephone, my least favorite analogy for the writing of the Gospels ever, right? That nobody could quite figure out Jesus's relation to the Samaritans? Or does it make more sense to say all these later writers knew what came before, and we know that we have some Samaritan believers in Jesus by the book of Acts, and all of this anti-Samaritan stuff does not play well? And John says, well, didn't you know that while the Jews, John's catch-all term, right, problematic though it may be, while they were rejecting Jesus and trying to kill Jesus, here was this village full of Samaritans who knew Jesus' true identity as Savior of the world. Now that is a pleasing gospel if you are a Samaritan, and you can reinterpret the others in light of it. It all depends on which one comes out on top. And if John is my set of lenses through which I read the other gospels, then I can make sense of this. Well, that one time, that one village was not so hospitable. And yeah, that one time Jesus said not to include them, but Jesus himself was busy preaching to them. So big deal that the Samaritans didn't get the apostles preaching. They got Jesus himself, right? And that Mark says nothing about the Samaritans is not a problem at all once John gives you a Jesus evangelizing and revealing himself to the Samaritans. So that's my long-winded Samaritan snowball. But again, I think if you go from Mark to Matthew to Luke to John with each subsequent author knowing the previous gospels, it makes the most sense to say, okay, they're all having to account for these Samaritan believers, and this is the way they did it.
No, that's it. Thanks. That's really helpful. What, like, in terms of, you do have a few statements in the book in terms of the motivation of the authors that you don't want to, you kind of want to stay away from, like the theological motivation and look at it more as kind of like at a literary level, providing explanations, kind of as you suggested, like almost like gap filling or something like that.
Yeah. It's a little bit of both for me. I mean, there are places where, I mean, these books are theological texts. Don't get me wrong. What I'm getting at times in the book is to say redaction criticism. When we've talked about why one gospel writer would use another as a source, but redact or edit it. 9 times out of 10, if not 99 times out of 100, it had to balloon into this idea of there was this deeply held theological belief, and the author was then the spokesperson for this church who held these deep convictions. That's the stuff I'm trying to toss out. I'm trying to say, Robin Walsh, let's stop it with all of these gospel communities if we're thinking of the authors as mouthpieces for their churches. And when we look at why an author might change something, let's start on the rhetorical level. So the sword fight is a classic one for me, right? A guy gets his ear chopped off when Jesus gets arrested. That'll get you an R rating if you're making a film. There's some gore involved in that. And so Luke, he's not afraid to turn the cursing of the fig tree into a parable, but he's stuck with a sword fight. But you know what Luke has a problem with? Where did the swords come from? I imagine him reading Matthew and Mark and saying, swords? Who said anything about swords? Who was carrying swords? There's a guy who gets his ear chopped off. So at the end of the Last Supper, Luke has Jesus say, by the way, guys, you should sell your shirt and buy a sword. And the disciples are like, we have a couple of swords. Jesus says, that'll be enough. And you're thinking, like the old adage, if you you show a gun in Act 1, it needs to go off by Act 3, right? So when you get to the garden and there's a sword fight, Luke has foreshadowed this. Now, for centuries, people have tried to say, well, what is Luke trying to say about can Christians serve in the military? And do you have a right to self-defense, or can you defend? Those are all great questions to ask theologically, and your tradition can answer them however you want. I do not think that is Luke's motivation. I think he's stuck with a sword fight, and on a rhetorical level, he does not like surprises. Do not throw Luke a surprise party. He hates surprises. So that is one of several instances where we see Luke setting something up so that you're not surprised by it. But that's not to say that there's not a theological agenda at work in other places.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. Thanks for that clarification. I totally makes sense. Totally agree. I was thinking about John's interest in, I guess, providing a very radically different perspective on, Jesus's attitude towards his impending death and the arrest scene and Jesus carrying his own cross. And it seems like John very much wants to have Jesus in full control at all times.
I wonder why John didn't have Jesus nail himself to the cross, if I'm being facetious. He absolutely is in control of this. But it's another one of those nods to the synoptics. What am I going to do? Come all of this time and ask the Father not to let me drink this cup? You don't think he knows that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus is praying for the cup to be removed? So he's like, give it to me. I'll drink it up and drink it down. Give me another cup. And so that's an intentional rewriting. Mm-hmm. And theologically, we get to the Gospel of Peter, right? Mm-hmm. And Jesus appeared not to suffer. Mm-hmm. And that becomes the reason why we only have a fragment of the Gospel of Peter, because the idea is, this is now the heresy of Docetism. Mm-hmm. It only seemed like he was human because he didn't really suffer. Can we just reread John for a moment? Because it sure doesn't seem like Jesus is in a lot of pain, even when his side gets split open, right? He's still talking and, hey, take care of my mom, and all of this kind of stuff. So there is some theology at play there, even when it's at odds with what came before. But you mentioned this earlier with other texts. They don't have to be identical. Right. I talk about the so-called Greek epic cycle. We've got the Iliad and the Odyssey. Well, that didn't stop people from writing prequels, sequels, and interquels. And where there's overlap with what Homer himself wrote, we know from the fragments that we have that sometimes those stories were retold very differently. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't mean they were done independently. It means they were very intentionally imitating Homer, but at times they could rewrite the story that you knew so well. And if you couldn't do a little of that, you didn't have any surprise element, and you didn't have any need to read your book.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's great. All right, so I guess I don't want to. We're probably running out of time, but I do want to mention this because it's a part of your book, and you move from the Gospels building up themselves to the Christological implications of this kind of development. And so you have a chapter kind of arguing, I'll let you say more about it, but kind of arguing that really the snowballing effect to John's gospel is what becomes super important for the later development of Trinitarian theology, which you argue John is really instrumental in. So I don't know, maybe if you want to say a couple words, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but if you want to say a couple words about the importance of not just the development of the fourfold gospel, but how that, back to your example of John kind of becoming the lens through it that helps explain the others, why that's so important.
Absolutely. No, I'll talk all day about it. I think it's important, and not just not just for how John came to be interpreted, but how I think John wanted to be interpreted. I'm not one to shy away from making claims about authorial intent.
Good.
So when it comes to Trinitarianism, and this started back in my dissertation because I had a chapter about this donkey prophecy from Zechariah that Matthew and John have in common. And I started thinking along these lines, and I have little tidbits of it, but it took me about 10 or more years to really flesh it out. What's going on with prophecy, I argue, is very much a model of the Trinity that we don't see until Constantinople in 381. And so many people want to say, well, it's totally anachronistic to read the Gospels in light of these later creedal formulations. And I share a lot of that skepticism if we're talking about something like neo-orthodoxy and Karl Barth, and well, we have the creed, and so everything has to be interpreted through this, and it almost takes away the need for critical scholarship at all. Why would we even bother to do exegesis? Let's just all be theologians. And so I think we still need to do exegesis. But one of the things that I found surprising is that you've got a Father, a Son, and a Spirit. We all know that. We've got that in Paul's letters. We've got that in the Synoptics. We don't have much of an idea of how they are interrelated. But I think that John does have a notion of how they are interrelated. And I think that prophecy is where you see it. Because God is the one who is speaking the word, but it is Jesus who is identified as the Logos, as the Word. But what happens at two key moments, at the beginning and at the end of John's Gospel, is that Jesus himself, the narrator, will say that Jesus has done something that is in fulfillment of prophecy. And remember that Matthew has given you a whole bunch of prophecies that Jesus is said to fulfill. And it kind of leaves you questioning, like, well, why didn't everybody just recognize him to be the Messiah he so clearly was? And John explains that no one could comprehend it in the moment. Jesus had to be glorified, by which he means give the Spirit. He has to raise from the dead and give the Spirit to the apostles so that they could then remember something that happened and put the pieces together. So what we have is the Father speaking the word, and then the word is falling on deaf ears. It means nothing. It's incomprehensible. It's like if you don't speak German and someone starts speaking German to you, right? It takes the Spirit to be your interpreter and to make sense out of it. Well, at the Council of Constantinople, that becomes this model we call the economic trinity, that what we don't want is the heresy of modalism, that first, there's a God who creates the world, there's a Son who saves the world, no. The Father, the Son, and the Spirit have to create the world. The Father, the Son, and the Spirit have to save the world. Now, it's the Son who dies on the cross, but it is the triune God who is doing the saving of the world. I don't think any of that is foreign to John's thinking. And I think the way he treats prophecy shows us this antecedent that it took a long time for a later council to pick up on this model, but I think it's right there in John. That the Father, the Son, and the Spirit are all involved when it comes to prophecy. And when at Constantinople, the idea becomes, okay, we need the Father, the Son, and the Spirit all to be acting in coordination at each moment, John would say, yeah, you got it right. You understand. That's what I was doing when Jesus fulfills prophecy in my gospel. The other gospels, again, all they give you is a Father, the Son, and a Spirit. John gives you this model of prophecy that we don't see fully realized until the Council of Constantinople in 381. But I argue that John is very much a Trinitarian thinker, and that it's not quite so anachronistic if we're very careful and very limited in how we connect those dots to say, I actually think that's what John had in mind.
I love it. That's a great, very provocative, but really good stuff. Yeah. So kind of like the Johannine grammar, Trinitarian grammars are all there, sort of in place, and what's being teased out later is maybe at a more of a philosophical level, using different language and categories, how you explain the grammar, but the grammar is there.
Absolutely.
For John.
And before we get to Constantinople, we have Nicaea.
Of course,
and of course we're interpreting John, and we have rival interpretations. Does being inside the bosom of the Father mean that the begetting took place at some unimaginable areas, the pro-Arian and the anti-Arian interpretations? We can see how, okay, John kind of lays open, doesn't really settle that one for us. But when we get to this later model of, okay, how does the Trinity work, is that it's a total delegation of separate tasks. And it becomes essential to the church to say that's not the way to understand the workings of the Trinity. The triune God is all coordinated in their work, in the workings of anything by the one in substance God. When I look at what John does with prophecy and the way he is particularly trying to explain a problem that he's inherited from Matthew, lo and behold, he works something out that fits exactly with the way later, centuries later, Greek philosophy can pervade all at once. But John would say, he's using the word logos, which the Stoics loved too, right? So it's not as though Greek philosophy is entirely foreign to John in the first place.
That's a great point. All right, well, there you go, everybody. You get not only a book on gospel origins, but also on Christology, all there in one, and written in a fun, engaging style. Wow, really impressive, Dr. Barker. Thank you so much for the book and for your time.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. I'm glad to have the opportunity and appreciate so much the work that you're doing.
Yeah, it's great. I'll be recommending this book because it's a fun read and really illuminating. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please make sure that you are subscribed to our channel for more content. And if you're interested in supporting us, the best way you can do so is by becoming a member of the Center for Bible Study. Link in the description. Thanks.